If you make a critical architectural decision at, say, 9 in the morning, the data suggests you have about a 65% chance of approaching it with, nuance, rigor, and a healthy assessment of risk.
Right, which is what you want.
Exactly. But if you make that exact same decision at 4 in the afternoon, the data shows your brain will, actively sabotage your company's product.
That's why.
It will literally choose the riskiest, most destructive path available just to save a few milligrams of glucose. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at your brain on an empty tank.
It is arguably the most silent, unmeasured threat to any technology company today. I mean, we spend millions of dollars auditing our code bases,
Oh, totally.
auditing our infrastructure, our security postures,
Yeah.
but we spend zero time auditing the biological state of the people actually approving those systems.
Right. And think about your own Slack right now. If you're in technical leadership or, engineering management, you know exactly which channel you're dreading checking after this deep dive.
Yep, we've all been there.
You know that feeling of being completely hollowed out by 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, staring at a massive pull request or a roadmap change, and you just want it to go away?
Yeah, you just want to click approve and close the laptop.
Exactly. And that feeling isn't a character flaw. It is a biological inevitability. And that's exactly what we're unpacking today. We've got a fascinating stack of internal documents to guide us.
We do.
There's a core briefing called The Architecture of Choice, a very contentious paper outlining the debates and tensions around how we manage mental bandwidth, and honestly, a truly terrifying case study on late afternoon decision-making.
What makes these sources so compelling is that they move past the generic productivity advice.
Yeah, the whole get more sleep thing.
Right, get more sleep, drink some water, take a walk. I mean, they dissect the actual mechanics of cognitive collapse.
Okay.
So our mission today is to pull this apart. We need to understand the biological hardware we're working with, why it betrays us in the late afternoon, how to build structural systems to protect our teams.
And this is the controversial part.
Yes, this is where the documents get really controversial. The immense danger of taking those protective systems way too far.
So before we can talk about fixing the problem or, building these protective systems, we have to look under the hood. We have to talk about the physical hardware inside our skulls. According to the core briefing, all of this stems from the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, the prefrontal cortex is basically the seat of executive function. It's responsible for working memory, impulse control, empathy, and
long-term strategic planning, right?
exactly, long-term planning. So whenever you are weighing trade-offs, anticipating future failure modes, or even just actively listening to a junior engineer, you are relying entirely on the prefrontal cortex. But here is the critical limitation. Conscious decision-making is incredibly expensive from a metabolic standpoint.
The briefing drops this statistic that really it put it into perspective for me. The human brain accounts for roughly 2% of our body's total mass. 2%,
Right.
But it actively consumes 20% of our total energy.
And that energy distribution isn't static, right? It's not just a flat burn rate.
Wait, really? How does it fluctuate?
Well, when you're deeply engaged in evaluating risks, say, deciding whether to adopt a new microservice framework, your prefrontal cortex is actively burning through localized glucose reserves.
Wow.
It requires intense, synchronized neural firing. It is not a magical infinite well. It's a strictly finite physical resource. Every single choice depletes that cognitive bandwidth.
Let me jump in here because I think people hear prefrontal cortex and they just think, oh, it's my CPU.
Right, yeah.
But the brief makes it clear it's much worse than that. Think of the prefrontal cortex less like a multi-core processor and more like a single-threaded event loop with a massive memory leak.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. It can process complex logic brilliantly, but every time you force it to context switch, checking a Slack message, jumping into a roadmap sync, going back to the code base, it fails to garbage collect the previous thought.
Exactly.
You are leaking memory with every micro decision. By 3 p.m., the whole system just hangs.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. And what happens when that biological system hangs? As those neurochemical resources dwindle, the brain enters a state of profound cognitive depletion. It goes into survival mode.
It's just trying to keep the lights on.
Right. It actively seeks shortcuts to conserve whatever glucose is left. This is the physiological mechanism behind decision fatigue.
But if this is just raw biology, if we all have this exact same hardware running out of glucose, why does it manifest so differently in people? Because look around any engineering floor at 4 p.m.
Yeah, it's a mess.
Some leaders just snap. They get incredibly mean. They make reckless choices just to end a meeting. But other leaders completely freeze up. They turn into statues. Why the split?
So the sources outline that this depletion essentially forces the brain down one of two evolutionary default pathways. The first is impulsive action.
Okay, impulsive action.
This is when you make a hasty, poorly thought out choice simply for the psychological and physical relief of crossing an item off your cognitive to-do list.
Oh, wow. So it's literally about just stopping the pain of deciding.
Yes, you aren't choosing the optimal option. You are choosing the fastest option to escape the metabolic burden of deciding.
Just approve the PR so I don't have to look at it anymore.
Exactly. The brain says, the threat is this complicated decision. Eliminate the threat immediately.
That makes so much sense.
But the second pathway is total avoidance. Status quo bias.
And the numbers on this are staggering. The data in our sources shows that under extreme cognitive fatigue, over 40% of corporate professionals default to maintaining the status quo.
40%.
They just freeze the board. They do nothing.
And if we look at the underlying mechanism, it makes perfect biological sense. Selecting a new, superior alternative requires active mental processing. It requires evaluating the unknown, projecting future states, calculating risk.
All of which burns glucose.
Exactly.
Wow.
All of that burns glucose. The status quo, on the other hand, even if it is a deeply flawed legacy system that is currently on fire, requires zero active processing to maintain. It is the path of least metabolic resistance.
So people just procrastinate on critical choices. They punt them to the next quarter or the next meeting, which instantly creates severe operational bottlenecks. And the briefing goes into vivid detail about the cascading impact this has on a team. Because decision fatigue doesn't happen in a vacuum. A leader's fatigue poisons the entire team's velocity.
It creates a massive blast radius. Think about how a technical lead's behavior shifts when they hit that state of exhaustion.
Yeah.
In the morning, they might offer proactive guidance, mentorship, deep architectural insights. But by the late afternoon, that leadership style completely deteriorates into reactive gatekeeping.
Because your brain is actively rationing glucose, right?
No.
The text explains that it literally shuts down the neural pathways required for empathy and nuance.
It does.
So when a junior developer comes to you at 4 p.m. asking for architecture advice, your brain categorizes them not as a human being needing mentorship, but as a biological threat to your remaining energy reserves. That's why you snap at them.
Which creates an incredibly toxic and frustrating vacuum for the engineering teams below them. Imagine being a developer blocked on a critical path dependency.
It's the worst feeling.
You can't merge your code, you can't finalize an API contract, and you can't deploy a feature because your designated decision maker simply lacks the metabolic capacity to sign off. The code reviews become superficial, either a blind looks good to me, or conversely, vague dismissive feedback that doesn't actually help the engineer move forward.
And it breeds this culture of pervasive anxiety. Engineers start second-guessing their own autonomy. They worry that their exhausted leader is going to arbitrarily reject their work, not based on the technical merit of the code, but purely because the leader's event loop is hanging and they're in a biologically bad mood.
Exactly. You end up with an entire organization paralyzed not by a lack of engineering skill, but by a collective metabolic deficit at the leadership level.
Which brings us perfectly to this case study. The sources don't just leave this as an academic theory. They walk us through exactly what this impulsive action default looks like in the wild, at scale. We have this composite story of a leader named Sarah.
Yes. Yeah.
She's a director of engineering at a hyper-growth fintech startup. She manages a core ledger system.
So we are talking about transaction data, user balances, the lifeblood of the company. The stakes could not be higher. And the case study paints a picture of a brilliant leader trapped in a vicious cycle of chronic decision fatigue.
Let's look at the micro decisions leading up to the crisis. It's 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. Over the last 6 hours, Sarah hasn't just been working, she's been bleeding cognitive energy.
Right.
Back-to-back Zoom meetings, context switching between a hiring dispute, a roadmap alignment sync, and a dozen Slack escalations. Her cognitive tank isn't just low, the warning light has been flashing for 3 hours.
And this is precisely the moment when her lead database engineer approaches her with a highly nuanced, extremely urgent dilemma.
Of course it happens at 3 p.m.
Always. They're hitting a wall with their database infrastructure. The engineer presents the fork in the road. Do they patch a legacy Postgresful sharding mechanism, which is a known entity but is actively struggling to scale under their new user load? Or do they initiate an immediate high-risk migration to a fully distributed NewSQL database.
This is not a trivial question. You're choosing between a slow strangulation by legacy tech debt or jumping out of an airplane and hoping you can weave the parachute on the way down.
Right. Now, the case study explicitly highlights who Sarah usually is. Under normal circumstances, on a Tuesday morning, with a full tank of gas, she handles this brilliantly.
Yeah, she's a great leader.
She is known for her rigor. She would normally convene a whiteboard session. She would aggressively interrogate the latency metrics, demand a failure mode effects analysis, and facilitate a deep debate on long-term scalability with the principal engineers. She knows how to manage this risk.
But on this specific Tuesday afternoon, staring at an overflowing inbox and a glowing red notification badge on her dock, her exhausted prefrontal cortex is screaming for an exit. The text makes it clear. She literally cannot fathom the metabolic cost of a whiteboard session.
No, absolutely not.
Her brain perceives the whiteboard as a physical threat.
So she bypasses her entire intellectual framework and succumbs to impulsive action.
She gives this wave of the hand dismissal. She just looks at the engineer and says, quote, just do the migration over the weekend, whatever gets it working.
It is the textbook definition of prioritizing immediate cognitive relief over the systemic safety of the product. She chose the fastest route to end the conversation.
And the fallout is absolute carnage. Because they lacked that rigorous morning review, the weekend migration hits an unhandled transaction deadlock. It cascades. Critical customer financial records get temporarily locked.
Which in fintech is a nightmare.
A total nightmare. It triggers a massive P1 incident, waking up the entire engineering rotation at 2 a.m. on a Sunday.
The damage to customer trust is severe, but the internal damage is almost worse. The resulting rollback, the postmortems, and the remediation efforts set their entire product velocity back by 6 weeks.
6 weeks of engineering time vaporized because of a 5-second decision at 3 p.m. And the core takeaway from the source document here is profound. The root cause of this massive incident wasn't a technical bug in the database engine.
No.
It wasn't poorly written code by the lead engineer. The root cause was a cognitively depleted leader making a mission-critical choice.
This is why the case study is so vital. It forces us to reframe how we view systemic failures. When a system goes down, we audit the code, we run automated tests, we check the infrastructure logs. We rarely, if ever, audit the biological and cognitive state of the person who approved the architecture in the first place.
It is terrifying, and the document draws a direct parallel to this famous behavioral economics study, the judicial parole study.
Oh, this is a foundational piece of research in choice architecture.
So researchers looked at parole boards in Israel, analyzing over 1,000 decisions. They found that prisoners who appeared before judges first thing in the morning were granted parole roughly 65% of the time.
A significant majority.
Right. But for prisoners appearing late in the day after the judges had been grinding through complex cases, experiencing severe decision fatigue, the favorable rulings dropped to near 0%. Zero.
It's unbelievable.
And the researchers noted this was completely independent of the severity of their crimes or their behavior in prison. It was the exact same type of case, just a different time of day.
It is a staggering real-world illustration of the status quo bias we discussed earlier. Granting parole is an active decision. It changes the state of the world. It carries risk.
Right.
It requires the judge to actively process the prisoner's rehabilitation and project future behavior. All of that requires massive glucose expenditure. Denying parole, however, maintains the status quo. It keeps the prisoner in prison. When the judge's prefrontal cortices were depleted, they defaulted entirely to the option that required zero metabolic energy.
So, if my biology is actively conspiring against my code base at 3 p.m., I can't just, try harder. Willpower isn't a strategy.
No, willpower will always fail.
Right. Are technical leaders effectively sending their own projects to prison just because they haven't had a break? How do I actually build a firewall around my brain before the fatigue sets in?
The short answer is you have to build systems that intercept the choices before they reach you. If you rely solely on willpower to navigate your day, biology will win 100% of the time. This is why the briefing transitions heavily into systematic defenses. Since we cannot fundamentally upgrade our brain's metabolic limits, we have to protect our teams from Sarah-style disasters through structural interventions.
Let's get into these structures because the sources offer some really robust practical frameworks. The first one is called the Triage and Deferral Matrix.
This matrix is a methodology for ruthlessly categorizing incoming choices into 4 operational buckets: automated, delegated, scheduled, and executed. The goal is to dramatically reduce the volume of decisions that actually require your conscious attention. Let's unpack each, starting with the automated bucket.
This one feels the most natural to an engineering audience, right? It's about taking recurring, low-stakes choices and handing them over to pre-established rules. In an engineering context, this means relying heavily on linters, CI/CD gates, or strict policy documents.
Right, like Dependabot.
Exactly. If a minor dependency update passes all automated security and test suites, it just gets automatically approved and merged. No human intervention, no pull request review required from the lead.
Exactly. You are permanently removing that entire class of decision from your cognitive load. The machine decides. The second bucket, however, requires a bit more cultural shift. It is the delegated bucket. This involves actively pushing autonomy down to the lowest competent level within the organization.
Meaning, senior or mid-level engineers are explicitly empowered to make architectural calls within their specific domain, without needing executive sign-off every single time. But I want to push back on how this is usually implemented. Usually delegation is sold as a time management hack. I don't have time to look at this, you do it.
But the briefing argues that delegation isn't about saving time at all. It's about preserving metabolic energy for decisions that only the leader can make.
Ah, that's a huge distinction.
It really is. When leaders hoard decision-making power, when they insist on reviewing every single PR or approving every minor cloud expenditure, they aren't just creating a workflow bottleneck. They are actively draining the exact cognitive resources they will desperately need when a real crisis hits.
If Sarah had heavily delegated the day-to-day hiring disputes or the roadmap syncs, she might have had enough glucose left at 3 p.m. to realize the new SQL migration was a suicide mission.
Precisely. Which leads to the third bucket in the matrix, scheduled. This is about taking those high-stakes, strategic choices, the ones that carry massive risk and require deep, rigorous thought, and explicitly restricting them to specific high-energy windows during the day.
For most people, the text notes that window is typically the first 2 hours after waking up. The core principle of the scheduled bucket is to categorically prevent critical decisions from bleeding into the late afternoon fatigue zones. You never, ever make a database migration decision at 3 p.m.
If Sarah had utilized the triage matrix, that conversation with the database engineer would have gone entirely differently. Her response wouldn't have been, just do it. Her response would have been, this belongs in the scheduled bucket, put this on my calendar for 9 a.m. tomorrow, and we will whiteboard the latency metrics. The entire disaster is averted through categorization.
And finally, the fourth bucket is executed. This is for issues where the stakes are genuinely low, the blast radius is minimal, and perfection is the enemy of progress. You use time-boxed heuristics to just handle it immediately, move on. Don't schedule a meeting about a minor UI tweak.
Right.
Just pick a color and deploy it.
So the triage matrix handles the active flow of incoming decisions. But the second major framework the briefing outlines deals with the physical and digital environment itself. They call it choice architecture and environment design.
The premise here is that decision fatigue isn't just caused by the big choices. It is massively compounded by context switching and environmental clutter. Every little thing around you is silently draining your executive energy.
The term the researchers use, background cognitive load. Every single browser tab you leave open is a tiny unresolved task demanding a microscopic fraction of your attention.
Oh, I have like 50 open right now.
We all do.
Yeah.
But every notification badge glowing red on your monitor, every unstructured Slack channel buzzing in your peripheral vision, they are all metabolic leaks.
They're the background apps draining the battery before you even open the heavy application. So the text argues that engineering leaders need to ruthlessly enforce strict deep work protocols. You batch your communication into designated asynchronous windows instead of letting it interrupt you all day. But choice architecture goes even further. It's about pre-deciding the mundane elements of your actual life.
This is where we see the tactic of standardizing daily routines to preserve maximum cognitive reserve for complex, ambiguous problems.
The ultimate example mentioned in the text is the Steve Jobs uniform. Jobs famously wore a black turtleneck, jeans, and New Balance sneakers every single day.
Right.
And the source points out this wasn't just a branding exercise or a fashion statement, it was a deliberate biological hack. He eliminated the micro-decision of choosing his clothing every single morning so he could allocate that cognitive budget entirely to Apple's product architecture.
And it extends far beyond clothing. The text advocates for eating the same nutritious breakfast, utilizing rigid, unbreakable meeting agendas, and establishing standardized templates for technical design documents. If you automate the trivial structural elements of a task, you preserve your creative energy for the content of the task itself.
Okay, stop right there. Because while I deeply understand the biology of the glucose drain, this all sounds incredibly sterile.
It does sound a bit rigid.
Right. If I automate my clothes, if I eat the exact same oatmeal every day, if I standardize every single meeting and rigorously sort every thought into a triage matrix, am I just turning into a robot to survive the workday? It feels like we are stripping all the spontaneity, all the joy out of the creative process just to optimize a biological metric.
That is a very natural and common reaction. But the sources provide a brilliant counterpoint to that fear,
Yeah.
specifically highlighting what they call the paradox of choice in tooling.
Yes. This was such a surprising fact.
It completely upends how we think about freedom in the workplace. Research shows that engineering teams, given an unrestricted, infinite array of programming languages, libraries, and microservice frameworks to choose from, actually experience significantly higher rates of developer burnout and depression.
You would naturally assume total freedom would make engineers happier. Build it however you want.
But it doesn't. Having to constantly evaluate, debate, and justify every single technology choice induces chronic, low-grade decision fatigue. Every pull request becomes an existential debate about framework philosophy.
Are we using React? Are we using Vue?
Exactly. Conversely, teams that operate within a tightly curated, heavily opinionated technology stack, where the tools are pre-chosen for them, report much better mental health, higher job satisfaction, and vastly higher productivity.
The curation, the restriction of choice, doesn't make them robots. It frees them from administrative noise. If I don't have to argue about which CSS framework to use for the 10th time, I can actually focus my energy on solving novel engineering problems for the user. The constraint actually creates the freedom.
Exactly. You are offloading the structural burden so the creative engine can actually run.
But that brings us perfectly into the debates and tensions document. Because my pushback about turning into a robot is actually shared by a lot of heavy hitters in this space. The sources don't just present these systems as a flawless utopian cure-all. They actively debate whether there is a massive danger to all this aggressive systematization.
This is where the deep dive gets really nuanced. The source text steelmans the counter-arguments, presenting them in their absolute strongest possible form. The first major counter-argument is the risk of hyper-bureaucratic delegation, leading to what they term bureaucratic sclerosis.
Bureaucratic sclerosis. If leaders are constantly using the triage matrix to deflect every single micro-decision down to their teams or over to automated policies, the critics argue they start losing touch with the physical reality of the codebase.
The fear is the creation of a fragile ivory tower culture. If you completely insulate yourself from the day-to-day friction of the code, how can you possibly make informed macro-level decisions?
You can't.
You end up alienated from your own engineering organization. You become a leader who only looks at dashboards, completely disconnected from the actual pain your developers are feeling.
And the text makes this incredibly compelling point about innovation. It argues that some of the most critical breakthroughs in product strategy and software engineering don't come from a perfectly scheduled 9 a.m. matrix meeting with a standardized agenda. They emerge from unstructured, high-friction, deeply messy, ambiguous debates.
If a leader is obsessed with minimizing their own cognitive load above all else, they might prematurely shut down a messy but entirely necessary debate just to preserve their energy. They avoid the friction, but in doing so, they kill the organic, chaotic communication required for breakthrough innovation.
Yeah.
You need leaders who are willing to wrestle directly with complex trade-offs, even when it is metabolically expensive.
So there is a very fine, dangerous line between protecting your brain and just abdicating your job entirely.
Precisely. And that leads directly into the second major tension debated in the text, which is one of my favorites, the fallacy of morning productivity superiority.
Oh, this completely tears down the scheduled bucket from our matrix. The matrix tells us, put all your big decisions in the first 2 hours of the day. That's when the brain is fresh. But the text says, hold on a second. What about biological chronotypes?
Right. A chronotype is essentially your biological clock's natural preference for sleep and wakefulness. The literature points out that while many corporate structures are built for Lark's morning types, a massive portion of high-performing technical talent, particularly in software engineering, are night owls.
Yep.
They experience peak cognitive arousal and deep focus in the late afternoon or late evening.
Right. So if you rigidly force a night owl to make a massive architectural decision at 8 a.m. just to satisfy the rules of the triage matrix, you are actually hitting them at their most metabolically depleted state. You are creating the exact danger you're trying to avoid. The text even notes that forcing complex decisions on someone who is groggy and rushing to clear a morning schedule can lead to incredibly reckless risk-taking.
And there is a deeper psychological mechanism at play here, too: the incubation period. Opponents of the rigid morning-only rule argue that deep contemplative problem-solving cannot always be scheduled like a dentist appointment. It often requires letting the subconscious mind process complex information in the background throughout the entire day.
You read an architecture proposal at 10 a.m., you let it sit, you go for a walk, you write some unrelated code, and then at 4 p.m. the solution suddenly clicks. So by the time the late afternoon rolls around, what looks like fatigue to a morning person is actually the culmination of hours of subconscious synthesis for a night owl.
Exactly. The late afternoon can be an incredibly fertile ground for creative synthesis. But, and this is a crucial caveat explicitly noted in the text, it is only fertile provided the individual has managed their energy baseline effectively throughout the day.
That's the catch.
If a night owl has spent 8 hours burning out on administrative noise, fighting in unstructured Slack channels, and sitting through pointless syncs, they won't have the energy for creative synthesis at 4 p.m. anyway. They will just be exhausted.
Okay, so this is a massive operational knot. If the systems are too rigid, we alienate our night owls, we kill organic innovation, and we build ivory tower leadership. But if we don't have systems, we end up exactly like Sarah, crashing the fintech servers because we wanted to end a meeting at 3 p.m. So if we are tearing down this morning-only bias, what actually goes in its place? How do I build a safety net that protects my prefrontal cortex but doesn't turn my workplace into a sclerotic bureaucracy?
This is where the final document, the Tactical Recovery Blueprint, becomes essential. It acknowledges all of these tensions and offers a highly practical middle ground. These are actionable steps that you can implement tomorrow to protect your team's cognitive health, regardless of their chronotype.
Let's spend some real time breaking this blueprint down, step by step. The first mandate is establishing hard cognitive boundaries, and the text is clear. This isn't just a polite suggestion to take a breather. It's about structural enforcement. They advocate for instituting hard no-meeting blocks during peak operational hours.
This directly addresses the core environmental problem Sarah faced. You have to protect those peak windows, whenever they occur, for your specific biological chronotype, for asynchronous deep work, complex architecture reviews, and high-stakes strategic choices. You cannot allow synchronous meetings to cannibalize your most valuable cognitive hours.
But let me push back on how this works in reality. If I am managing a global remote team, spanning time zones from San Francisco to London to Bangalore, how do we enforce no meeting blocks? My 9 a.m. peak is someone else's midnight. If we all block off our peak hours, we literally never speak to each other.
That is the defining challenge of remote engineering management. The blueprint suggests that in highly distributed teams, the hard boundary isn't necessarily about synchronizing the time of the deep work, but standardizing the format of the work, which leads perfectly to the communication protocols they recommend later in the blueprint. But first, you have to constrain the volume of decisions.
Right, which brings us to step 2. The rule of 3. The blueprint suggests limiting your high-impact discretionary decisions to a maximum of 3 per day. Wait, 3. If I'm a director of engineering managing 40 people, I make 3 decisions before I finish my first cup of coffee. How is limiting to 3 mathematically possible without paralyzing my entire organization?
You're confusing micro decisions with macro decisions. Approving a PTO request is not one of your 3. The rule of 3 applies to high-impact discretionary choices, the ones that alter the roadmap, change the architecture, or impact personnel. Think of it as a strict metabolic budget constraint. Once you have executed those 3 major choices, your prefrontal cortex is largely tapped out for heavy lifting. At that point, the rule dictates that you must push all remaining non-urgent macro decisions to the following day or aggressively utilize the delegated bucket.
It essentially forces you to prioritize, because if everything is an emergency, nothing is. If you know you only have the cognitive budget for 3 big choices today, you are not going to waste one on a trivial UI debate.
Exactly. It naturally enforces the triage matrix. It forces you to ask, is this decision important enough to consume one of my 3 slots, or can my lead engineer handle it?
Step 3 of the blueprint targets how we actually communicate those choices, and this directly addresses my complaint about remote time zones. The text mandates enforcing asynchronous decision documents, specifically relying on RFCS requests for comments.
The psychological goal here is to completely eliminate live, spontaneous decision-making in synchronous meetings. When you demand a major architectural decision in real time on a Zoom call, you are relying entirely on the participants' current glucose levels, their immediate working memory, and their ability to withstand social pressure. It's an environment highly prone to error and impulsive action.
Because if I'm tired on a Zoom call, my brain will just agree with whatever the loudest person says just so I can hit the leave meeting button.
Right.
But by using an RFC, you force the trade-offs, the risks, the latency metrics, and the alternatives into a written document. You articulate the entire problem state in advance.
And the magic of the RFC is that it allows all the stakeholders to review the document and comment asynchronously on their own time when they are at their own cognitive peak. The morning larks can review it at 8 a.m. The night owls can tear it apart at 10 p.m. It completely removes the biological pressure of real-time performance. It creates a critical buffer between the stimulus, the engineering problem, and the response, the architectural choice.
Which brings us to the final and I think most profound piece of the blueprint, building circuit breakers. This is entirely about cultivating deep self-awareness. You have to train yourself to recognize the somatic markers of decision fatigue within your own body.
Somatic markers are the physical or emotional signals that your cognitive tank is emptying. Your brain is trying to warn you before the system hangs. The text lists common examples: sudden, inexplicable irritability, feeling unwarranted impatience when reviewing a perfectly normal pull request, or most tellingly, feeling that overwhelming, almost physical urge to just say yes to whatever is being asked solely to end the conversation.
The Sarah reflex, just do it over the weekend.
Precisely. When you feel those markers, the blueprint teaches you that you must act as a circuit breaker for the organization. You must explicitly announce a pause. And the provided script in the text is absolutely fantastic. You look at the engineer and say, this decision is too important for my current energy level. Let's revisit this fresh tomorrow.
This decision is too important for my current energy level. I absolutely love that phrasing. It doesn't say, I'm too tired to deal with you, which implies the person is a burden. It frames the delay as a profound respect for the gravity of the work. It says, your work matters too much for me to give it a depleted brain. It's a feature, not a bug.
And by using that specific phrasing, a leader normalizes biological reality in the workplace. It gives the junior engineers permission to recognize their own fatigue and pull the circuit breaker when they need to.
So we have covered a massive amount of ground today. We have gone from the granular neuroscience of glucose depletion in the prefrontal cortex to a massive fintech system failure caused by a 3 p.m. wave of the hand. We've debated the merits and the massive dangers of rigid triage matrices and Steve Jobs' sweaters, and finally walked through a highly nuanced blueprint for daily survival. But the source material leaves us with a few massive, unresolved tensions, questions that frankly don't have easy answers, and that we want to pose directly to you, the listener, to wrestle with in your own org.
The first question the text leaves unresolved is the exact boundary of delegation. Where is the precise line between empowering your engineering teams through aggressive delegation and completely abdicating your leadership responsibility when complex technical trade-offs arise?
Yeah.
If you delegate every hard choice to save your own energy, what are you actually being paid to do?
It's the ivory tower problem. And second, we touched on this, but it remains a huge logistical knot. How on earth do you truly synchronize these high-energy cognitive windows when you're managing global remote teams? If my team spans 4 time zones and 3 different biological chronotypes, how do we ever achieve that vital, messy, high-friction debate without someone being at a biological disadvantage?
And the third question, which ties back to the fundamental debate on systematization, does the relentless pursuit of eliminating friction and decision fatigue inadvertently sanitize the workplace? By removing all the cognitive stress, do we accidentally eliminate the creative friction that is absolutely necessary for deep, disruptive innovation? Can you build the next great product in a perfectly automated environment?
These are incredible questions, but I want to leave you with one final provocative thought that builds on everything we've unpacked today, something that isn't explicitly answered in the text but feels like the natural conclusion. Think about physical exercise. If you put your arm in a cast to protect it from stress, the muscle eventually atrophies. It loses its density. So, if we spend our entire careers building highly automated systems, strict triage matrices, standardizing our tech stacks, and utilizing rigid choice architectures just to shield our brains from making micro decisions, do our underlying decision-making muscles eventually atrophy? By trying so hard to save our cognitive energy, by curating our life so perfectly, are we slowly losing our innate human capacity to handle the messy, unstructured chaos of the real world when the systems eventually break?
It is a deeply uncomfortable paradox to consider. In our quest to optimize the brain, we might be weakening it.
It really is. So the next time it's 3 p.m. on a Tuesday and you feel that hollowed out exhaustion creeping into your chest while a developer demands a critical answer on a database migration, remember Sarah. Remember the smartphone battery running on 1%. Protect your prefrontal cortex today, pull the circuit breaker, and let the problem wait until tomorrow.